The year was 1914. The greatest war had broken out in Europe, and their fighting strategy, trench warfare. The trenches were spread across the Western Front, a 400-mile stretch weaving through France and Belgium from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This is where the war was fought. So what is trench warfare, and why was this war fought in the trenches? How long did this go on for, and how did it happen? What was life in the trenches like? How many problems did they face while living there? Trench warfare can be defined as warfare in which opposing armed forces attack, counterattack, and defend from relatively permanent systems of trenches dug into the ground. A trench system might begin with small foxholes that later develop into a trench. They make trenches by digging up soil and using them to create raised parapets. Trenches were pretty useful for the most part because they provided protection from bullets, but they had their own problems such as disease within them. They were created in the 17th century by the French military engineer Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban. Thanks to his invention, several wars were fought in the trenches, especially World War I. This war was fought primarily in the trenches. The German leader Wilhelm II invaded Luxembourg and Belgium to get to Alsace-Lorraine. When they arrived, the French army was ready for them, leading to the Western Front battle. They developed trenches to fight in, and this lasted for 4 years. That's crazy, right? The soldiers fought here for 4 years and therefore had to figure out how to live there. So how did they do it? Here's a picture of how they lived in the trenches during the war. As you can see, some of them have books out and they're all just huddled together. While they probably managed to find a way to live in the trenches, they had to deal with other complications such as disease and death. So how were their lives impacted? First off, with all of the dirty men living in such poor conditions, they ran the risk of developing trench foot, trench fever, dysentery, and cholera. There were obviously more diseases that ran amok, but these were some common ones. With death being so common in the trenches, they had to find a way to deal with dead bodies. They would often bury them in cemeteries behind the trenches, but sometimes it wasn't that simple. Other times the body would be in the no man's land, and so every once in a while they had a ceasefire to go collect bodies and bring them to the cemeteries. Sometimes the bodies lay where they are for days and eventually sink into the mud. Here's a picture of a World War I cemetery. As you can see, there's crosses where all of the bodies lay. Most soldiers got between 4,000 and 5,000 calories of food a day. It wasn't until a couple of years into the war when Europe began having major food shortages and the soldiers were fed less and less. The water situation was worse though. They often didn't have access to clean water as it was chancy, so alcohol was a fan favorite in the trenches. They also had coffee. It was just some coffee grains mixed in the water. Soldiers often slept wherever was safe, or they slept in small corners of the trenches basically on top of each other. They all suffered from sleep deprivation. Even though life was rough in the trenches, they still played games, listened to music, read and wrote letters, and gained great companionship. Most soldiers stayed positive for the war and looked for the good things in their situation. After the war, most trenches were filled in for farming, although they left some open so that you could still see where they had fought.